In this segment, I want to continue with the theme of cultural tension in the 1970s. We talked about feminism and women's rights in the last segment. In this segment, I want to take up the ways in which the civil rights movement in America, which began with African Americans and by the mid-1960s had spread to other minority groups, by the 1970s had spread even further. Some historians have seen this expansion of this quest for rights as part of a larger expansion of freedoms in the United States. Freedoms being granted to all citizens across racial, ethnic, and gender and orientation lines. In this segment, let's talk about Native American resistance. In 1968, we see the creation or the establishment of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, which is it's a fairly radical organization, but it's designed primarily to draw attention to the plight of Native Americans and to Native American history in this nation. In November of 1969, the American Indian Movement occupied Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, and they held it for 19 months, garnering a great deal of media attention. 1972, members of AIM would occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Washington, D.C. And then in 1973, and one of the best known of these incidents of the time, Native Americans and members of AIM occupied Wounded Knee in South Dakota for 70 days in a standoff ultimately with federal officials. You may recall, and one of the things that makes Wounded Knee so culturally significant is the massacre that occurred at Wounded Knee back in the 1890s. That sort of tail end of the story of Native Americans on the Great Plains, a somewhat sort of a very emotionally troubling sort of event where the bodies of Native Americans were left in those frigid temperatures having been shot down. And it's part of that larger point that I was trying to make way back when about race and ethnicity in America. So the choice of Wounded Knee becomes a highly symbolic and highly important choice for protest and drawing media attention. Another area that begins to become more and more important in the late 60s and certainly into the early 1970s is the issue of gay rights. This, again, movement toward this quest for greater respect under the Constitution. June 1969, in Greenwich Village, there'll be a riot that occurs at the Stonewall Inn, which was a traditional club, bar, if you will, for homosexuals, for gays. The thing is that traditionally, because being homosexual had been so looked down upon by society, the police generally had no reason to fear from society any backlash if they harassed or otherwise even beat up people over the issue of sexual orientation. What makes Stonewall different is the fact that in this case, the patrons at this particular bar said no more. In other words, we're not going to be treated differently. We're not going to be harassed simply because of sexual orientation. And what followed then was what we'd seen before in other major American cities, and that was essentially a riot, a backlash, a reaction. And it was quite violent. But it begins, the Stonewall riots begin a larger process, a larger campaign for gay rights. In 1974, the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from its official list of mental disorders. It's not much, but it's a beginning. 1975, the United States Civil Service Commission will include sexual orientation as an issue for consideration in cases of job description. In other words, the United States government by 1975 has begun to recognize the potential for discrimination based on sexual orientation. Again, it's not much, but it's one more step. By the late 1970s, a much larger and notable gay rights movement had emerged, including parades in many of America's largest cities. And we began to see the first openly gay political figures and openly lesbian political figures emerging in American political scene. The point of all this is simply to suggest that what starts, and there's no really great starting point, but that civil rights as an issue, as a campaign, not only continues into the 1970s as an issue, it doesn't simply go away with the 1960s, but in fact, it transforms and in many ways expands as more and more groups begin to claim their rights under the Constitution. We'll pick up in the next segment with a sort of different view yet again.